Thank you for joining us for the Upper Peninsula Publisher and Authors Association virtual conference presentations.
As most of you know, I am Brandy Thomas. If you get letters from me about membership dues and all that fun stuff. But I am also an editor and writer myself. I'm originally from Springfield, Illinois, have a BA from Eastern and master's from Southern Illinois in actual communications and mass media, of all things. And I've been a producer, copywriter, copy editor, video editor, and videographer for nightly news. I've worked with various production companies, recording audio and video, as well as editing, writing, and editing. So as I said, this is how to make your resume as confusing as possible, because do I edit? Yes. What do I edit? Yes, everything. So I've edited video, I've edited audio, I've written scripts, I've edited scripts, I've written in fiction, nonfiction, kind of a little bit of everything. So I'm also obviously on the board of directors and been the membership chair for UPPAA and also the recording secretary my first 2 years, and have been the membership chair for the last 4. And if someone doesn't run for it, will be probably for the next 2 as well. I've also been published in the UP Readers 4 and 5. I'm also a member of the EFA, which is the Editorial Freelancer Association. And right now I work as a freelance editor. I specialize in science fiction and fantasy, and as well as children's books, but I'll edit pretty much anything. And in addition to that, I also have recently started doing audiobook narration, and I also do audio editing. And so if any of you listen to the UP Reader, when all of those come out, you will hear me talk even more. So that's a little bit about me. So what does an editor do? Well, the very fine point, an editor makes your work the best it can be by working with you and your vision. That is essentially what an editor does. It is to make your book the best it can be. We're generally not doing our own books. Sometimes that gets forgotten. So the editor is working for the author, the reader, and the publisher. And yeah, all these groups want one thing: to not have mistakes in their editing. So what do editors not do? Because I get this question a lot. Tyler probably does too. I don't do the layout. Well, some people also have a book production company or a small publisher, which do handle some of these things as well and work with people. But if you're hiring a freelance editor, they're not doing, they'll check your layout to make sure it's accurate, but they're not doing the actual layout or the interior exterior design or indexing or the permissions, unless you're specifically hiring a permissioned editor. They're not handling the printing run. They're not your agent or marketing. Ghostwriting, sometimes people put under editing, but it is not always technically editing. That's a whole separate ball of wax, so to speak. So I'm going to get into the different types of editors, because I get this question a lot where people go, I want you to proofread my book. Well, do you want me to check the spelling, or do you want me to help you with the layout? Do you want me to help you with the overall story? What exactly do you want? And there's a couple kinds of editors. They're more typically specific to traditional publishing. Acquisitions editors, managing editors, associate editors, they're usually with newspapers, magazines specifically. Independent editors and traditional publishing editors have copy editors, which is what most people think of when they say they want an editor. Developmental or substantive editors, line editors, proofreaders, editorial consulting, and there's a whole lot of other niche things that fall under all of those as well. Sometimes you have someone that needs a read over of a sensitivity reader and go, should I be writing this book? Is what I'm saying in this book, is this offensive, or am I handling this the right way? And sometimes finding the right person for that can be a challenge but is well worth it in the long run. And I'm going to go into a bit of detail on each of these types of editors, because I find one of the biggest things that people have questions on is, what does an editor do and what is the process? And we'll be covering both those things. The traditional publishing editor types, the acquisition editors, that is the person when they say, I work for a publisher and I'm sending it into the editor. They're the person that goes, yes, we want our publishing Penguin wants to publish your book. And they're your primary contact at a publishing house. An independent editor is not the acquisitions editor. The managing editor is basically the bridge between editing and production departments or freelance production professionals. So if you have, a person that's doing your illustrations, they're coordinating between them, the author, the publisher. They're managing everything because they're the manager. Then a managing editor or section editor that works in newspaper and magazines kind of has the same responsibilities as an acquisition editor, and they tend to be more proactive in seeking out stories and content. A lot of those, when you send things into slush piles and things like that, when they open up things for submissions, it's going to an acquisition editor or a managing editor at a magazine. Editorial consulting. This is kind of getting into the things that you can hire an independent person to do. So this is kind of basically, I have an idea for a book. How do I do this? How do I start putting this together? Is this idea workable? Is there 500 other books that have come out about the exact same thing? So if you're writing a book that's very similar to I have a vampire and they sparkle like Twilight, and it's the year after Twilight came out. By the time it gets in production, it's probably not going to be very good selling, because everyone's going to, oh, it's a Twilight knockoff. So, they can kind of help, usually kind of give you an idea of what's is this a good idea or not? Now, if you think you have a really good idea, even if it's been done recently, don't let that hold you off. Sometimes just wait on it for a while. Wait till it's died down and, everything old is new again at some point. Developmental editing can also be called substantive or content editing. Different people have different names for it. This is one of the major types of editing. And for fiction, it involves, like I have here, broad changes such as overall plot, world building, character descriptions, personalities, pacing, voice, story, structure, and dialogue. And, some of this is, I edited a book that in the prologue had a whole long description. They're in the middle of a theft. And as they're stole the thing from the king, they're sitting on the rooftop looking over the city, and they basically give a 25-page description of how settlers came down the river and the city was founded. And it's like, no, we need to cut all of that out, or at least not have it in your prologue. And so this is what developmental editing is. It's helping develop your story. You're not really concerned so much about grammar and punctuation at this point, because if you rewrite a whole chapter, you don't want to have to pay someone or do it yourself to edit things twice, or edit something that's no longer going to be there after you change it possibly. So a lot of people, this is kind of their first step. If they're not quite sure if their story needs tightened up, if they say, I have a 250,000 word novel, do you think that's too long? And you're going, yeah, probably. This is where you would tighten all of that up. Copy editing is what most people think of when they think of editing. It's correcting grammar, syntax, punctuation, and spelling. It's making your text conform to either a style sheet that you have or one that's created for you. And we'll talk about style sheets a little bit later on, what that actually is. But this just makes sure your thing is consistent, your work is consistent, there isn't any missing commas or grammar errors, or this is sentence level changes. And it can range from literally fixing, the commas and spelling and wrong words, to also reworking sentences on a literal sentence by sentence level. You've got the overall story pretty much intact in the way you want it, but this is getting all those fine details, and it's focusing mostly on the mechanical issues. The biggest confusion that sometimes comes in is a proofreader is not a copy editor. There's some people use it interchangeably, but they are not the same. And we'll get to a proofreader here in a moment. A line editor is essentially basically a heavy copy edit. It can sometimes be called the same thing. Editing terminology, as I mentioned here, there's a lot of overlap. Some people do more than one thing. Sometimes you're doing more than one job at a time, where you're both, sometimes doing developmental editing and then coming back later after they've reworked and doing an actual copy edit. A lot of times it's good to have a little bit of a time break in between, because you've seen stuff long enough that you're going, ew, I know what it should say, but does it actually say that? So giving yourself the editor and yourself a break, and setting your document aside for a little bit and giving yourself time to refresh. But a line editor basically goes line by line through your manuscript. And this is, you get lots of notes saying, did you mean to say this? Line editors are not trying to be mean. Editors in general, we're not trying to be mean. We're just trying to make your work the best it can be. Proofreader, as I said before, is not the same as a copy editor. A proofreader is someone who provides a final check of the electronic file for minor mistakes in spelling, punctuation, spacing. So everything that everyone that submitted to the UP Reader just got back today, you got a proof of your work, where you're proofreading that final proof. Like I submitted a poem and the line is cut in a weird spot where it was just a hair too long, so it's moved down and it messes up the spacing. That's things a proofreader would catch. They're not necessarily looking to fix your grammar. They're not looking to fix they're just fixing like minor mistakes, not making major changes. If you're making major changes after you've done the layout and typesetting, you need to go back and reevaluate where you are in the process, because you don't want to pay for someone to do a full layout and typeset of your manuscript and then be changing chapters and, adding chapters or any of that, because no one will be happy with you at that point. So children's books, and I know Eric here, his daughter has a children's book, and I know there's a couple other people as well, but children's books do have a few different things. Board books, picture books, early readers all have slightly different editorial processes than a book that's all text, because they're sometimes almost all image. Chapter books and young adult books, basically anything that's primarily pictures, goes through a different editorial process than adult books. Young adult books that are, chapter books and older and young adult books pretty much go through the same process as an adult fiction book or nonfiction book. You still have the copy editing, the substantial editing, stuff like that. And art direction and critique is often part of the editor's job with children's books. And one of the things as an author, when you're talking with an editor, knowing who, with children's books, picture books especially, are the author and the illustrator the same person? Are they different people? Is the author hiring the illustrator? Is the illustrator hiring the author? Are they a husband and wife team? Are they friends? Do they only know each other because they hired someone? That's all important to know. And it's important to know as an author as well, so you can let your editor know who is making the final decision. Because I have worked on children's books before where the illustrator is basically just someone hired to do the illustrations, and they have input and, you know, yes, I can do this or I can't draw that, but the final say is with the author. And I've also had the reverse where it's mainly the illustrator and the author is, or do they have equal things? Letting your editor know that as well is a very important thing to do, because it's a whole different dynamic than adult fiction and nonfiction. So does anyone have any questions? I'll pause here for a moment. Does anyone have any questions? I know I'm going kind of fast through everything, but I've got a lot of information. No questions?
I do, Brandy. Yeah, if you might get to this, and so you can just tell me, but about how much is each types of these editing processes? I mean, how much do they cost?
We'll get to that.
Because right now it sounds like there's a lot of different. Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, that's coming up. That is the ultimate question that everyone has. Any other questions about the actual different types of editors? Okay, and there will be time at the end as well. So the process, the basic process, and I'm kind of excluding children's books for the most part from this, that they just have an additional steps with illustrators and stuff like that. But the general process is, first of all, as an author, figure out what type of editor you need. Are you working on the overall story idea, or are you good with that? And are you looking at someone to fix your spelling and grammar and things like that? Or do you need someone to go line by line and really tweak everything? The other thing that a lot of people don't realize is you need to figure out your timeline of due dates. If you've told your layout person, oh, I have an editor, I'm going to find an editor and I'll get it to you in a week, that's not going to happen. Well, I mean, it might, but it's highly unlikely. I am scheduling people about a month out-ish right now. If you contacted me today, sometimes people get a lucky break where I have things, you know, open up sooner. I finish something faster, but if you have a hard due date, you need to work backwards from that and give yourself plenty of time, because and also editing, if you have a 100,000 word book, it takes a while to go through. It's not like you can just read, it's not like sitting down and reading a novel. As an editor, you're going through in a detailed way, and it takes a while. So make sure to plan that into your plans, because that is probably the two things that I run into most often, that people are like, oh, can you get it back to me next week? And it's like, no, I cannot. So most editors, you can, and I'll later on discuss how you can find editors. You can request a quote, send a short sample. That helps the author, you know, you see how the editor likes the comment and work, and also helps the editors get a good gauge of what they're going to charge you and how long it will probably take them to do. And it's also a good thing to sometimes go, okay, so I specialize in science fiction and fantasy and horror as well, but a romance novel is not my strong suit. You know, if it's copy editing, it doesn't matter as much. But if you want a substantive editor, someone that works with story, it's good to look for someone that specializes or has experience in the type of fiction you're looking for, because they know the conventions of that type of story. If you have someone that hates science fiction, you don't want to send your space opera to them and go, this is the coolest thing ever, and they're going to go like, yeah, well, why do they do this? Well, you know, if you're if you're familiar with the conventions of the genre, they will be a much better editor and a much better fit for you than someone that isn't. And some editors just, don't like doing some things. Some people don't like doing romance, or some people don't like doing horror because it's just, they're uncomfortable with it. And knowing that starting off is a good thing. So that way you can find someone that's a good fit. And then send off your manuscript to your editor. I put, this should not be a first draft, because I have gotten first drafts before. And first drafts are rough. You should have done some self-editing first. Maybe this is the point where you have friends and family read it over, and yeah, your friends are going to be nice and your family's probably going to be nice. I mean, I don't know your family, but mine generally is. But it can give you some, they'll point out some major things, or some, alpha readers, or however you want to do it. Run it by some people before, self-edit some. And then once you think you've got it to the best shape you can get your manuscript, then send it, then start looking for an editor or send it out to editors. It will save you money in the long run, because they have to do a less intense edit usually and have to go over it less times. And it just saves everyone time and, money and frustration in the long run. And then wait while they edit. Like I said, we can get a manuscript and it might be 3 weeks before I actually start editing it. One of the things I highly, and Tyler, who also edits, can probably back me up on this. This would be a wonderful time while you're waiting to familiarize yourself with how to use track changes in Word. This is a huge stumbling block for a lot of people. And track changes is kind of the industry standard for the most part. And it makes things so much easier once you figure out how to do it. There's lots of great tutorials on YouTube. You can look up online. But while those couple weeks you're waiting to get your manuscript back, this would be a great time to do some research and learn how to use track changes. So then when you get your manuscript back from the editor, feel free to panic for a few minutes at all the markups changes that they made. Don't worry, we're not your 4th grade teacher. We're not trying to cover your thing in red marks. I do suggest for a lot of people that get really nervous about all the markup that they see on their manuscripts when they get it back, if you're familiar with track changes, to first read over the changes that your editor made with the markup turned off. So you're just seeing what the changes are. You're not seeing what changes have been made. You're just reading like a finished document. Then turn it on and see if that rings true for you, if you like that, how that sounds. Then turn the track changes on so then you can see the markup, and then go, oh, okay. And a lot of it is correcting, commas and this, you said the wrong 2 instead of 2 and there 2, or there and there. It's not major things. We're not trying to be mean. So then revise, go through and make or don't make changes as suggested. And don't hesitate to contact your editor if you have questions. Try and save them all to one, at least a chunk at a time, don't email every time you have a question. But if you have questions or something we say doesn't make sense, let us know, because we're people too. And we either make mistakes or sometimes aren't clear, and it makes perfect sense to me, but maybe not to you. And also, you don't have to make every change your editor suggests. They are suggestions, not commands. If you say, no, they talk in this particular way, or they use this turn of phrase, sometimes it's not grammatically correct, and it may drive me insane from a English nerd perspective. But if that's how you want to write something, as long as it makes sense and doesn't disrupt the flow and doesn't hurt your book, you know, but it's your book, not our book. Even though sometimes we may shake our head, but we still, you don't have to make every suggestion. And one of the other things is a lot of suggestions, especially things that I comment on, that you don't have to take our suggestion. Sometimes it's this phrase is awkward, and I may give a suggestion how to change it. And you may not take my suggestion, but you change it in some other way. That's fantastic. It's just that part is a problem and it needs to be changed in some way. It doesn't have to be my way. So you edit the revisions, then revise, and then you repeat as needed till you get to final proofread and a final finished manuscript. So you might need 2 or more different editors. I know I have passed on to people, and people have passed on to me that, hey, I need someone else to take a look at this. Or I've handled all the developmental editing and I've read this too much that I can't see what's there. So someone else needs to do the copy editing, or I can't fit it in my schedule because I wasn't planning on doing the copy editing and now I need to. So things like that, you know, you might need more than one editor, or, you know, one editor might do multiple jobs. One of the other things is beware of scope creep, as it's called. Have a clearly defined idea of what the editor is covering and adding more and more that you want them to do. Oh, since you're doing the copy edit, you know, since you did the developmental, can you also do the copy edit and the proofread and, you know, check the thing, you know, if they didn't agree to that, you know, make sure you state up front what you want covered. It will help everyone in the long run, and then your editor will want to work with you again, because there's nothing quite so frustrating as going, oh, you wanted me to copy edit it, but what you really wanted me to do was do a developmental edit, then copy edit it, and then, you know, it makes for a grumpy editor. And a lot of times, if it's too much, you know, I'm not super strict on I'm only doing this. If it's like, oh, okay, it's just a little more, that's one thing. But if you keep adding and adding and adding things, you know, consider if you should be paying them more too. So things that editors generally use. Chicago Manual Style is kind of one of the standards of, you know, reference books, depending on if you have dissertations or other articles or papers or books that are more specific things. You can have the, you know, MLA manual, APA, and, you know, I even made a mistake and listed MLA twice. Someone should have edited this. A dictionary, style sheet, house style sheet, and word processing programs. Microsoft Word with track changes is the industry standard and ideal. I have used Google Docs. It is frustrating to say the least sometimes, because people can change it as you go and their changes show up, and that's a whole nother thing. But so most people think of traditional editing markup. My daughter, who's in 4th grade, was very excited because she got to use these this year. And I was so proud because she's like, look, Mom, we get to, there's little symbols that you get to use when you get to correct things on papers. So this is what most people think of when they think of when you're making marks. Most people, I mean, and I can still, if someone wants to print it out and mail it to me, and I'm more than happy to do it that way. It just takes a while and it's easy to miss things. Most people do track changes nowadays, which I have here. You can see, and up at the top where it says track changes, and it'll show like the markup on the right hand side. This is just a rough, thing here where I went and made mistakes in something I wrote to show you what mistakes look like, where there's a word missing between the one thing, a misspelled word, and it'll say on the right, I'll make a comment that'll say stuff, or like the one thing here is the date's wrong. This is dated after the previous entry. The other dates are in chronological order. Should they be first, or is the date incorrect? That's something an editor should catch and go, oh gosh, I typed the wrong date in there. So this is just an example of what track changes looks like. And you can go through and accept and reject changes, so you don't have to accept them all. But this also helps you keep from missing errors that sometimes you miss when you have a paper and pencil markup. So the style sheet, which a lot of people go, style sheet, what's that? And not everyone uses one, but especially for longer books, they are very, very handy. And for most big publishing houses, have a style sheet that's specific to the publishing house. So all different editors have kind of different styles, and it's kind of personal how they like to lay things out. But it's basically a rule book for your book. So it's got a list of reference works. So what dictionary did you reference? What style guide did you reference? Are you using, excuse me, are you using Chicago Manual Style 17th edition or 16th? Are you using what version of the MLA manual or APA manual? Because that can make a difference, because things change between versions. And as long as you're staying consistent within the version, you're fine, but you need to make sure you're using the same version. So if another editor comes, if you're hiring 2 editors and your substantial editor changes things to make things consistent with Chicago Manual Style 16th edition, and your copy editor makes everything consistent with the 17th edition, you can have conflicting things there. It's just good to all be on the same page. Also, if you have slang terms, especially historic slang terms, if you're writing historical novels, where did you reference that? Where did you find that use? And historical references in general, what did you use as a source? So it has a list of style and usage choices. So what's the preferred use of grammar and syntax that doesn't refer to a specific word or term, or specific uses of grammar and syntax that differ from the standard. So a list of terms, so like proper names, preferred spelling for words that have multiple correct spellings, like spelling okay as okay versus okay, okay-ay, and non-standard spelling. So something like if you're doing a style sheet for the UP reader, do we put a period between the U and the P in UP reader, or do we not? Do we keep that consistent only through titles or throughout the whole book? What is the font we use for that every time? It has the little, the layout person has used the little, before authors' bios, has the little, reminds me of kind of a little fleur-de-lis or a flower. What is that we make sure and use that same consistent thing every time? So all style sheets pretty much have those. Sometimes a style sheet can also include a timeline. If you have a mystery and things are supposed to happen on certain days or at certain times, it's a good idea to keep track. As an editor, it's like, wait a minute, did that happen? Wait a minute, the person was murdered before that happened. That doesn't make sense in the story. So having an actual written out timeline can be helpful. Same thing with characters, especially names in fantasy books. There's all kinds of spellings that you want to know, that you want their name and their description. Some people count those as part of terms. For especially fantasy and science fiction, I tend to do them as a separate thing. So that way someone with those deep brown eyes on chapter 1 is still has brown eyes in chapter 42 and they didn't turn to green without some reason. So, and fantasy, science fiction, names, especially, and how they are spelled. Did I change from Brandy with a Y, like the drink, to Brandy with an I? That happens in emails. And just general descriptions. Same thing with places. What place are they at? And, you know, sometimes some people, you know, kind of include a basic map, the geography of the area. We know what the UP is like, but if someone said, oh, I drove from Houghton along, you know, the Great Lakes, Michigan, Lake Michigan is such a, you know, beautiful thing this time of year, and everyone up here is going, that's not right. That's Lake Superior, not Lake Michigan. But someone who lives in Arizona is going, it's Great Lake. So having a basic grasp of the geography of the area too is handy. These are all things that people can reference on the style sheet. Doesn't necessarily, everyone kind of does things a little differently, how they list things out. Some people are more in depth than others. For short stories, you don't necessarily need this, but for novels, it's extremely helpful. So, getting to the question, what do editors charge? Well, there can be a wide range of things and a different ways of charging. So people have charged a flat rate per project, by the hour, by the page. 250 words per page is a standard page. By the word, and this can vary widely by editor and the type of thing you're having edited. So proofreading, like super simple copy editing, like pretty quick, easy stuff is about generally 1 cent a word. Basic copy editing, about 2 cents a word. Heavy copy editing, line editing. Developmental editing can fall under this sometimes. Sometimes developmental editing falls a little less than this, depending on what you need, is about 4 cents a word. If you have very specific things, like if you're writing something that involves foreign languages a lot, or a lot of historical research where the person is having to do a lot of research, a lot of background checking on things, it'll probably be on the higher end of cost because the more work, obviously, an editor has to do, the, you know, more they're going to charge because that's their time. By the hour is probably the least common. I personally only charge by the hour for certain things that are small type jobs, that it's like or things like editing captions for paper, like tables, and that I've done some dissertations where there's a lot of tables. There is no way for me to estimate how long that's going to take. So it generally, most editors start about $30 and up, depending on how time consuming and how specific it is. If you have a very niche thing, you're going to pay more for someone to be knowledgeable in that very niche thing that they're researching to make sure it's correct. And everyone should give you a price up front. The vast majority of people, or I usually give if I'm doing a by the hour thing, which isn't very often, I'll say, you know, not to exceed this, and I'll check in with you at that point if we're at that point. And yeah. So where can you find an editor? We don't normally wander about in the wild. You can often find us at libraries, but usually things you're members of. The UPPAA has a resources page, which has a few editors on there. Myself, Tyler, and Superior Book Productions are the two main editors I know on there. You can also check out professional editorial organizations, the FAA, which is worldwide, ACES, which is the American Copy Editing Society, or the Society for Editing, which is also a nationwide organization. They also have specific job boards where if you're looking for something very specific, especially those of you who write nonfiction, that can be very handy if you're looking, if you want someone that's knowledgeable on, you know, biochemistry and how it works with whatever, you could probably find someone there. You know, fiction is slightly easier to find. There's also the Council of Science Editors. And ask your author friends. I bet they have editors, especially if they've been published. Ask other people if you know editors. And they don't necessarily handle your type of editing. I use Tyler a lot as an example here, because Tyler doesn't do children's books, but people contact him all the time about children's books. But I do. So he'll pass things on to me and say, hey, contact Brandy. And I've had things where people contacted me and I said, hey, contact Tyler. I don't know if any of them have contacted Tyler, but I know a couple of them have contacted me from Tyler's recommendations. So come to things like this. There's a whole bunch of resources that you probably don't even know you know where you can contact editors. So like I said, talk to other friends you have. You can also just literally search on Google as well. I do caution, if you are just searching on Google, there is a lot of suspicious and people who are trying to talk you out of your money. No one should be charging you to read, to do a sample edit for, you know, a couple of pages, or to just read your book, unless it's specifically they're giving feedback and whatnot. It is always better to go with someone that has reviews. There used to be a website called Predators and Editors. That was a very handy resource, and they're going through things right now where they're not currently up, but that used to be an awesome resource. But, you know, all of you belong to UPPAA. You know some other editors, or you know some editors here. You know other authors that have used editors. Ask on the UPPAA group list, the email list. There's all kinds of resources. So you can always check me out at Brandy, www.thomasediting.com. Do not go to brandythomas.com. That's a whole different site. And although I'm sure she makes good money, it's not editing, the other Brandy Thomas. So that's why it's thomasediting.com. So I will exit out of here. Does anyone have any questions? I know I had a whole lot of talking there.
I'd just like to throw out, I've had good luck using people from Fiverr.com, Fiverr.com, and Upwork. Any of the gig platforms, I mean, the people are reviewed scrupulously, so you'll do all right with that.
I thought it was a great presentation. Thank you, Brandy.
Yeah, this is Gretchen, Brandy. I have a question that I've saved. You've half answered it for me. I'm working with a nonprofit organization that we're putting together a cookbook. Is there a specific organization that I should look at for finding a cookbook editor?
EFA, the Editorial Freelancer Association, has a ton of people that do cookbook editing. It is a whole other world that cookbooks are weirdly hard to edit. And Tyler, I see Tyler nodding and going,
yeah, I refuse to do cookbooks.
Yeah, they're their own special brand of specialization that you never knew there was so many rules regarding cookbooks.
Right. Well, that's why I asked the question. Thank you for the resource.
Yeah, and they have a whole, you can post jobs for free on their thing, or you can just search. They have a database you can search for an editor, and you can narrow it down by cookbook editor and like all kinds of other things. I mean, you can narrow it down by horror, you can narrow it down by fiction, scientific editing, cookbooks, different subjects. I mean, there's probably like 100 different categories you can narrow things down by. It's a very
And
handy.
could you repeat the name of the site again?
It is www.efa- oh, you're going to ask me this, and I know it's the-efa.org.
Right.
And that's been
Thank
around
you.
since the 70s. Oh, and yes.
Brandy, I have a question. That was excellent presentation. When you were going through the process and you were talking about the edit, then you said revise and then your final proofread and final finished manuscript. Is that, when you get your final finished manuscript, is that something then that you give back to that same editor that gave you those suggestions, or do you then have to find a different proofreader editor?
When you get to your final finished manuscript, that's the point where you're usually printing or you're going to lay out. So you have that final layout,
Okay.
and then you do that final proofread to make sure your italics haven't disappeared, your name is spelled right, there's no typos, there's no weird line breaks, etc. And then you're going to print. So it doesn't have to go back
Okay.
after that proofread to your editor, or after they're done, or after it goes to layout if you're not having them proofread. And your
If you
editor
did want to have that,
oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just saying, if you did want to have, like, let's say I sent something to you and you gave me suggestions and I made the suggestions and I wanted you to read it again with the changes.
Yep, that's the revising process.
I'm assuming that's another charge. Yeah. Okay.
Not normally, or well, a certain number of revisions are usually included in the initial charge. So like, I'm not going to charge you for
Okay.
going over the first revision, and that I usually do two-ish usually is without a problem, depending on the shape the manuscript was in the first time I looked at it. And that kind of, the heavier the edit, that's why the more it costs, because we go over it more times. That's
And
a
then
lot of it.
maybe you mentioned it, but I can't remember. How do you charge?
I
Do you
usually
charge by the word or the page?
I usually charge by the word or by the project. And usually by the project is based loosely off of by the word. Because that's a good way to be consistent, because I know approximately how many words I can get through in a certain amount of time. And I can base that after doing like a sample and looking over stuff. I can go, okay, this is pretty good shape. It really just needs a light copy edit. This won't take me all that long, but it's still 100,000 words. So even going through 100,000 words quickly still takes time. Children's books, I tend to do a little differently because there's not a lot of words, but there's a lot of pictures that I'm going over to. And the words you do have are really important because you only have so many. So that's children's books is kind of a different, slightly different animal, where I usually charge a per project with a certain amount of revisions included, spelled out, because with children's books, you can get into the going back and forth a lot on one or two things. And so that way you kind of group it all together.
Right. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Brandy, I wanted to ask you about if you use Grammarly when you edit, or do you recommend it? Because I don't use it myself, but a lot of my clients say, well, should I use it before I send it to you? And I've kind of said, well, you know, it can't hurt. But recently I had somebody be like, oh, well, obviously Grammarly gave me lots of bad advice based on the edit sample you did. So I just wonder how you feel about it.
I personally don't use it. I've had people say mixed results as well. I've kind of said the same thing. I've said basically it probably won't hurt. It seems like the more editing they need, the worse job it does.
Hmm.
Is
Yeah.
the couple of people I've had, like if they need just basic, like, oh, you forgot some commas and punctuation and that part it seems fine on. But a lot of like the wrong word it doesn't always catch. I've noticed the like I said, I've only had a couple people use it because I personally don't, because I
Or it'll
don't trust.
suggest the wrong word.
Yeah,
It'll say you got IT apostrophe S, shouldn't it be ITS when it should be IT apostrophe S?
yeah.
So,
If I'm going over to check everything anyway, because I don't trust it, it's like I might have
right,
just did the first time by
right.
myself.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but I personally don't use it because, yeah, I've heard, some people love it, but I haven't found any of those people.
The people that have told me they've liked it, it's been more for the plagiarism
Yeah,
reasons, like, you know, it catches where they've over quoted from
that
the
makes
web
sense.
or something. Yeah.
Yeah, I could see it being very useful for that because you could check sources and it checks the web, based stuff a lot easier than having to go relook yourself on everything.
Right.
But for actual grammar,
Okay, thanks.
Anyone else have questions?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I'd like to hear more about the style sheet. I guess I'm one of those people that said, what? What's a style sheet? I mean, how big or depth are these things usually when you get them?
Well, they can be several pages or they can be a page or two. It really depends on your book. Like I said, not everyone uses a style sheet, but the first page is usually just references, what you're using to reference things. And then after that is the like names of like your main characters and descriptions, and that where it seems like a lot, but it's really not nearly as much information as you think. But it really helps on novel length works to keep things straight over time, where you're not going, wait a minute, their eye color changed or their age changed or the spelling of their name changed, where, oh, they mentioned this character in their grandchild in chapter 2 and they don't mention it again for 60 pages. It helps keep things straight, and it just really helps keep things straight, and it can be quite long. Like I said, depending on the book, I find fantasy books and science fiction books and horror tend to be, but science fiction and fantasy the most, tend to have the longest style sheets solely for the names and geography. Because if you say it's, how many parsecs was it to, did he make the Kessel Run? Well, wait a minute, if you look at the actual map of the solar system, that's not actually possible. It's not that far away. If you have a style sheet where you have a basic geography of, okay, it's 10 miles from the crossroads to Graverett Elementary School, it doesn't take, they didn't walk down the street to get there. It helps you keep everything straight. And as an editor, you're coming in, at least the first time you're reading it, where you don't know the geography of the thing, of your book. And it's it seems like a lot of work and it seems a lot of redundancy until you need it. And then you're like, paging back, what was the ancient king's name that they mentioned somewhere in this first 200 pages, but I don't remember exactly where. And also I usually, at least I do, I usually put a reference number or a page number where the first time it's mentioned. So if you have a name, the first time it's mentioned, going with that spelling, okay, they're mentioned on page 42. So that way, when I go back and reference it, I can go, is that spelled the same? That I can go, okay, wait a minute. Nope, that's not. And then I can always query the author and say, which spelling did you intend? So they're at least all consistent, and then you can go back and change them if you want them different. But does that make sense?
Yeah, that helps.
Yeah, like I said, they can be pretty long. Sometimes they're pretty short, but
Yeah, they would have to be if you if you want to get the eye color in there and.
and I mean it's not, it's not complete sentences either. I mean, like if I'm doing a basic description of someone, I'm not writing it down every time they're described, but just referencing, especially for the main characters. So, brown eyes, brown, I mean, I'll put like, okay, Brandy, brown eyes, brown hair, Tyler, short hair. Okay, I can't tell what color your eyes are. I don't know. Joe, gray hair, it's like I don't if they're wearing the same outfit the entire time. Okay, vest with tan shirt underneath, tan button-down shirt. So that way, if especially in like a horror novel, if the heroine is running away in her high-heeled shoes because she came from a fancy dinner, and then she's barefoot later, did she lose her shoes? What happened to them? Is she all of a sudden in running shoes? Did she change shoes because running in heels is painful and hard? What happened to them? Things like that.
So, on this kind of editing where you're looking for that sort of thing, that would be the heavy edit then, right?
Yeah. I mean, the basics of the grammar and punctuation and name spelling and that, I mean, you're looking for it always, but primarily in the heavier editing and that the grammar in that I still put on the style sheet even with a light edit. Just so I'm being consistent with things like spelling okay the same way throughout. Or spelling UP in the UP reader, or spelling things that aren't necessarily wrong one way or another, but you just want to be consistent throughout the entire book. I'm trying to think of like
Brandy,
Well,
I found an
being-
old style sheet that I could share with the group if you want.
okay, yeah, I have one. I have one too. Yeah, I have. Victor will
Before
be.
you,
Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, before you do that, I mean, maybe I'm just missing the point. Is the style sheet something the author does or the editor?
The editor does.
Is the editor? Okay.
Oh, the editor does that. Okay.
Yep. Oh, you have one handy? Yeah, no, the editor does it, not the author. It's primarily for the author. Yeah, there we go. Now, a lot
Is
of
this
times,
readable or should I blow it up more?
yeah, that's readable. Well, it is to me at least.
It's readable to me.
Yeah, this is the one we developed for Points North, and we actually got into a big argument about things like US2. Is it U.S.-2 or US2? And we ended up with the style sheet here. Things like World War I, you want to make sure you spell the same way each time. And commonly used things throughout the book like Cleveland Cliffs and DNR and things like that.
Or if you say the Sioux, do you spell it?
Yes,
It's
yes.
spelled S-O-O and S-A-U. Is it S-A-U-L-T? Yeah. I had to really think about how to spell the Sioux correctly.
Right. And it's county road or CR-505, that kind of thing. And it took some years, but Tyler finally got me to do all the Mackinacs correctly.
They're all different. Although if you say Mackinac and Gogebic enough, it stops making sense as a word. From a narrator perspective.
Ontonagon.
Well, it's when you get a bunch of them in a row where the town name and the lake name and the road name are all the same thing. And you're like, what? Yeah, no, the editor is the one who develops it. They'll often give it to the author, and a lot of times they'll talk with the author about it too, especially if you have more than one editor or you're going to hand it off or you want someone else to look at it, so that way you can all be on the same page. Yeah, being consistent on names are, and things, nonfiction names. How you list county, yeah, like how you list county roads, how you list putting periods between abbreviations, how you abbreviate things, what's the nickname for something, are all things that come up that you would put on a style sheet because everyone says it differently. Because it took me forever. A good example of this is actually when because I'm not from up here, like I said, when we moved to Marquette, people kept telling me, oh, that's over by the Peef. I'm like, okay, what is the Peef? I'm looking for the building that says Peef on it. I'm like, okay, I think it's over by everyone says over by the college, by the Peef. I'm like, what is the Peef? There is no building that says Peef on it. And that says physical education instructional facility, also known as the Peef, but no one says the physical education instructional facility. Everyone says the Peef, but it says nowhere on no sign, no anything, what the Peef is. So that would be something you would mark down in a style sheet and say, okay, it's referred to as this, but this is the official name, and whether you reference both or either or neither, you know, it comes up. If it's in a children's book about a daughter attending the Peef for dance, you can just say Peef because no one is going, you know, everyone goes, okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense. You know, it's on Northern's campus. But when you're giving directions to someone new in town and you say, oh, it's over by the Peef, you will have them very confused and driving in circles. It took me a good year to figure out where people were talking about because everyone would just say, over there by the Peef. And you're like, what is that? I mean, if you say the dome, okay, you can narrow that down because, well, it's the giant dome. But yeah, it's one of those things that a lot of people don't realize or don't do, but is very important and very helpful. Did someone have a question? I thought I saw a hand up.
Can I change the subject and ask another question?
Go for it.
When you get an editor or when you're looking for an editor, do you get a contract or is it a verbal agreement?
I usually write out, when I write out, I'll write out an email. I don't necessarily do a full out contract. Some people do, but I will write in an email, say what I'm covering, what I'm not covering, verify it with the person, and then I will also restate it in the invoice I send. So the invoice lists exactly what I'm covering, how many rounds of editing, that I'm doing this, but not that, and how much it'll cost, and the approximate due dates of things. So there is a paper trail. If people want a full-on contract, I can do that, but I found that works pretty well. And then, you know, by someone paying, they agree to what's in the, you know, invoice. Hopefully you're reading over your invoices. I don't make it like super long and complicated, but, you know, clearly state what I'm doing, what you're doing, what you're paying, what I'm, and what that covers. I mean, Tyler, do you
And
do
then
it
do you
differently?
pay up front?
Yes. I request at least half up front, if not the full thing, depending on the size of the project. Because I have had,
Thank you.
every once in a while, I've had one person go, well, you did everything. I think I'm gonna only pay half. Because they didn't like what I suggested. So I've only had that happen once, but it's kind of like, so. Tyler, do you do full contracts? Or
Yeah,
do
I basically, I have what I call an editing agreement, which is basically a contract but explains the process. And I ask them to sign it and send it back to me. And then I send them usually a PayPal invoice and they pay that. And sometimes they don't send me back the agreement, but I figure if they paid, that's like saying you agreed. So,
yeah. So basically,
and same thing, I always tell them I want half up front and half when done. But if you want to pay me the full amount up front, you get a 10% discount. Because I don't have to worry about, are you going to pay me? And I use PayPal because I got tired of waiting for, oh, the check's in the mail. And 3 weeks later, I've done all the work, but I'm still waiting for the payment. So that's how I do it.
I use Square to invoice, same difference. I will take checks from people. I will take checks from certain people, but overall, I still require at least half up front before starting work. Except for children's books, which I require the full thing up front because it can be a really long process depending on the illustrator timeline, where it can be 6 months, a year, hopefully not a year, but depending on how long, I mean, it literally just takes to draw things. So it kind of saves a lot of grief instead of trying to figure out midway through 6 months later type thing. But children's books, like I said, are slightly different for me at least. Any other questions?
So informative.
Like I said, I was trying to, I think Victor saw the number of slides and probably went, ooh, that's a lot of slides.
You pulled it off.
Great.
I can talk fast.
That was great. That was really fantastic.
Very good.
Like I said, and all editors have a little bit of different variety. We are not a monolith. We all do things a little different. And it's always good to talk with someone first before saying, hey, you know, it's your book. And usually once you find someone you like to work with, they like working with you. You end up working together a lot, or can.
All right, thanks, Brandy, and
Tyler-
thanks, everyone. We have a few resources that Brandy asked us to post, and we'll send that out tomorrow.
And there'll be the basically a rundown of the process, a rundown of kind of the different types of editor definitions, or the main things, kind of summarize what I had today.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thanks, that was time well spent.
Thank you, Brandy.
Thank you, Brandy.
Really, really very helpful.